I was a history major at Gettysburg, which, if you've ever been on that campus, is kind of like being a fish in the ocean. History isn't just a subject there, it's in the air, in the ground, a phantom limb of the town itself. This was back in 2011, my junior year. I lived in an off-campus house with 3 other guys, a creaky old place on Carlisle Street that was about 100 yards from the battlefield. You couldn't walk out the front door without seeing the rolling hills where thousands of men died. My life then was pretty standard for a college kid, juggling classes, procrastinating on papers, and spending too much time at the campus coffee shop. But there was always this undercurrent of something else. Late at night, you'd swear you could hear the distant echoes of a drum line, or the faint, ragged screams of men carried on a cold breeze. We all just chalked it up to the place. You live in a town steeped in that much bloodshed, and your brain just starts filling in the blanks. It becomes a part of the daily routine, a weird kind of normalcy. The story I'm about to tell, though, wasn't normal. It happened in Pennsylvania Hall, or Penn Hall as everyone called it. The place is a beast of a building, all brick and white columns, an architectural relic from another era. It's the oldest building on campus, and the stories about it are endless. Everyone knows the legend of the administrators and the elevator, but you hear so many different versions, it just feels like folklore. It's the kind of tale you tell freshmen to get a rise out of them. But on this particular day, a Thursday, I had a meeting with one of my professors, Dr. Albright, who had his office on the 3rd floor of Penn Hall. The guy was a Civil War buff, on a different level. He was a small, wiry man with a shock of white hair that stuck out like a dandelion puff, and he always smelled vaguely of old books and peppermint. I was working on a paper about field hospitals, and he wanted me to go over some primary sources with him, old letters and diaries that had been found in the university archives. I remember walking into that building, the air suddenly thick and cold, a different kind of silence settling around me. It was the silence of an old tomb, not a quiet office building. That I found Dr. Albright's office on the 3rd floor. The hallway was hushed, the heavy, dark wood doors looking like stoic sentinels. His office was exactly what you'd expect. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with volumes, a desk buried under stacks of papers, and a faint, sweet smell of peppermint. He was leaning back in his chair, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose, holding a small, leather-bound book. He gestured for me to sit, and we spent the next hour poring over these incredible, raw pieces of history, diaries from Union surgeons who had worked in that very building. I was so engrossed that I almost didn't notice the temperature drop. It wasn't just cold, it was a specific, penetrating cold, the kind that feels like it's coming from inside your bones, a chilling counterpoint to the warm afternoon light filtering through the high windows. I saw goosebumps rise on my arms and looked up to find Dr. Albright squinting at the wall behind me. "Just a draft," he mumbled, but his voice was too quick, too dismissive. I knew he felt it, too. That we wrapped up around 5 o'clock. Dr. Albright closed the diary he was holding with a sigh, a sad, heavy sound. "These men, they're still here, you know," he said, not looking at me, but at the empty space above my shoulder. "Not ghosts. Not exactly. Just echoes, like a sound wave that never quite fades." That single line hit me harder than any ghost story. It felt real, a profound statement from a man who had dedicated his life to this subject. I stood up, feeling that icy cold clinging to me. The hallway outside his office was now shrouded in shadows as the sun began to set. It felt different from when I came in, heavier. As we walked toward the elevators, I could have sworn I heard something, a faint, metallic scraping sound coming from the end of the hall, but when I turned, nothing was there. The air, which had been so stale and old just moments before, now carried a different scent, something sweet and metallic, like dried flowers and rusty iron. My stomach nodded, a primal, gut-level warning. When we got to the elevator, the doors were already open. I froze. Dr. Albright just stepped inside, as if nothing was wrong. He looked back at me, waiting, a knowing look in his eyes that was far more unsettling than any scream, and my feet felt heavy, as if I were wading through water, but I stepped inside anyway. The polished brass doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and a deep, humming thrum filled the small box. Dr. Albright pressed the L button for the lobby. The elevator began to descend, but it wasn't a smooth ride. It felt like it was moving through something viscous, slow, and hesitant. The lights flickered, a stuttering beat that made shadows dance in the corners. My eyes darted around the confined space, my heart hammering against my ribs. That smell of dried flowers and rust was now overpowering, a sickly sweet perfume that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I clutched the strap of my backpack, knuckles white. The temperature inside had to have dropped at least 20 degrees in the space of a minute. It was a tangible presence, a cold so profound it felt like a heavy coat draped over my shoulders. And it was getting heavier with every inch we descended, and I watched my own reflection in the brass doors, a pale, wide-eyed ghost. But then, as the lights flickered again, something shifted in the reflection. It wasn't me anymore. My reflection was still there, but superimposed over it, barely perceptible, was a different figure. A man with a gaunt face, sweat plastered to his forehead, his uniform tattered and stained a deep crimson. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, his eyes filled with a hollow terror. At the same time, the low hum of the elevator was replaced by a cacophony of sounds. The creak of wooden floorboards, the agonizing groans of men in pain, and a low, disembodied weeping. The whole box was rattling now, the sounds from outside so clear it was as if the doors were transparent. I spun around to look at Dr. Albright, but before I could say anything, a faint, translucent handprint, smudged with what looked like dried mud, appeared on the brass panel between us. My blood ran cold. The handprint was impossibly detailed, right down to the lines in the palm. I could see the thumb, the four fingers, and it was just there, pressing against the metal from the inside out. My breath caught in my throat. I was frozen in terror that I couldn't move. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, and the air was now so thick with the smells of sickness and damp earth that I felt like I was drowning. My eyes were locked on that ghostly handprint, which was now slowly, impossibly, beginning to fade, like a breath on a cold window pane. The groaning sounds of men in agony intensified, so close I could feel their pain echoing in the very bones of the building. Dr. Albright, who had been eerily quiet, suddenly reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding. "It's all right," he said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos. "Just breathe." And as he spoke, the handprint vanished completely. The rattling stopped. The smells and sounds vanished as if a switch had been flipped. The elevator lurched, the lights stopped flickering, and the familiar, mundane hum returned. We were descending again, but this time, it was just a normal elevator ride. When the doors slid open, it was like stepping from a nightmare into a stark, unforgiving reality. The lobby was bright, clean, and filled with the low murmur of students walking past, oblivious. The cold was gone, replaced by the warmth of the afternoon sun streaming through the grand, arched windows. I stumbled out, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I was shaking, the adrenaline making my entire body buzz. Dr. Albright stepped out behind me, straightening his jacket as if nothing had happened. He looked at me, his face unreadable for a moment, and then a strange, sad smile touched his lips. "I told you they were still here," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a century of untold stories. "They just want to be heard sometimes." He gave me a single, knowing nod, then turned and walked out the main entrance, leaving me standing there, completely alone, in a place that now felt less like a college building and more like a mausoleum for the unheard. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the normal world spinning around me. Feeling like I had just come back from a place no one else could see, I stumbled out of the building and onto the quad, the afternoon sun a harsh, blinding shock. Students were laughing on the grass, a couple was tossing a frisbee, and the world just looked normal. But it wasn't. I felt like I was wearing a suit of lead, my movements slow and heavy while everyone else floated on air. The vividness of the experience was almost maddening. It wasn't a shadow in the corner of my eye or a trick of the light. It was a physical sensation, a smell, a touch I could still feel on my skin, and the distinct image of a handprint that had no business existing. My mind kept replaying the events, the way the hum of the elevator had morphed into a symphony of suffering, the terror in the eyes of the soldier in the reflection. It wasn't a memory, it was a scar. I couldn't just shake it off and go back to my life. I was still in that elevator, and everyone else was a million miles away. I walked the entire way back to my house, 100 yards from the battlefield, but it felt like I was crossing an entire continent. When I got inside, the smell of my roommate's leftover pizza and the sound of the TV felt alien. I sat on the couch, unable to speak, the words caught in my throat. How do you tell someone that you just shared an elevator with a ghost hand and the collective agony of 100 years ago? They'd laugh, or they'd think I was crazy, and for a terrifying moment, I wasn't even sure I wasn't. But then I remembered the look in Dr. Albright's eyes, that knowing sadness. He had seen it before, or something like it. This wasn't a one-time fluke or a trick of my imagination. It was a reality that existed right alongside our own. It wasn't something you fought or ran from. It was something you had to deal with that I knew I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen. As night fell, I felt an almost magnetic pull to go back. I grabbed my backpack and, on an impulse I still don't fully understand, I scribbled a note on a piece of paper, a simple message to a fallen soldier from one of the diaries I had read in the archives that afternoon. It was a note about courage and loss, a brief acknowledgement of the horrors they had endured. I stuffed it in my pocket and walked back to Penn Hall. The building was dark now, a hulking silhouette against the starry sky, but the windows on the upper floors held a faint, yellowish glow. The air was cold, but this time, it felt different. It was a quiet cold, not the aggressive, chilling cold from before. I didn't take the elevator. I climbed the stairs, the creak of each step echoing in the silent corridors that I found my way to the third-floor hallway. The air was still and heavy, but not menacing. I stopped at the spot in front of the elevator where I had stood just hours earlier. I pulled out the piece of paper and held it in my hand, my heart a steady, slow drum. I whispered the words I had written. I wasn't speaking to the air. I was speaking to the echo, to the sound wave that never faded. We see you. We remember. I stood there for a long time in the silence, listening, and for the first time, I felt a kind of peace settle over the space. The metallic smell was gone, replaced by the faint, comforting scent of old wood and dust. The oppressive cold lifted, and in its place was just a cool, neutral air, like a room after the window has been opened. It felt as if a heavy weight I hadn't even known I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. The echoes had been heard. After that night, I never had another experience like it in Penn Hall. The campus still had its eerie moments, the feeling of being watched, the sounds in the distance, but the malevolence, the raw terror I felt in that elevator, was gone for me. The building wasn't a haunted place anymore. It was a place with a history that I now, in a very personal way, was a part of. Dr. Albright was right. It wasn't about ghosts. It was about being a witness, a keeper of the stories that were too heavy to be carried alone. I finished my degree and moved on with my life, but I never forgot that day. And every time I think of it, I feel that unique combination of dread and honor. The horror was not in what I saw, but in the realization that there are parts of the past that are not past at all. They are right here, waiting for someone to listen. This happened back in the fall of 2012, my first year at the University of Toronto. I was a wide-eyed freshman, completely clueless, living in residence at Christie Mansion. For those who don't know, it's this stunning old building, all red brick and ivy, with a history that everyone on campus loves to whisper about. I was studying poli-sci and history, and the idea of living in a place with so much backstory, even if it was just an urban legend, felt like something out of a book. My room was on the third floor, a cozy little space with a huge, arched window that looked out over the campus. But the real star of the show was the library on the main floor. The place was like something out of a Gothic novel, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, rich mahogany paneling that seemed to absorb the light, and a fireplace that was never really used, just a dark, gaping maw in the wall. The air in there always felt thick, heavy with the smell of old paper and dust. I spent most of my evenings there, hunched over my textbooks, thinking I was a real academic. The legend of Room 29 was something we all knew. It was part of the welcome tour, a spooky little detail to make the place feel more interesting. We'd all laugh about it, a bunch of skeptical 20-somethings who thought we were too smart for ghost stories. The story about Robert and his mistress, and how she was supposedly trapped in this secret room behind the library's paneling, was just a fun little campfire tale. I remember one of the RAs, this girl named Sarah, who had been there for 2 years, telling us that the door to room 29 wasn't even a real door, just a decorative panel that someone had painted a 29 on as a joke. We all bought it, of course. Who wouldn't? It made the story feel less real, less like something that could actually happen. I mean, we were living there, after all. But there was this strange vibe in the library sometimes. A kind of static electricity in the air, a feeling of being watched, especially late at night when the only sound was the rustle of turning pages and the distant hum of the city outside. I just chalked it up to the old building settling, the wind rattling the ancient windows. But looking back, it was a prelude, a quiet drumbeat before the storm. It was a normal Thursday night, and I was in the library, as usual, trying to finish a paper on the Napoleonic Wars. It was well past midnight. Most of the residents had gone to bed, and the only light came from my desk lamp, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The silence was so profound it felt like a presence itself. It was the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to get up and stretch my legs, to just move around a bit. It was as if something was pulling me toward the far corner of the room, to the heavy, mahogany bookshelves that ran along the east wall. As I got closer, I saw something I'd never noticed before. The wood paneling near the corner, the part Sarah had joked about, didn't seem to be flush with the wall. There was a faint, almost invisible seam, and it looked like it wasn't part of the regular design. I ran my fingers along it, and the wood felt colder than the rest of the paneling, and it had a strange, subtle vibration, like a distant, low-frequency hum. I pressed my ear against it, but all I could hear was the faint sound of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a whisper, so faint it was barely there, like a sigh of wind through a cracked window, coming from inside the wall. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded choked with dust and despair. It was just one word, repeated over and over: help, help, help. It was so quiet and so filled with sorrow that it felt like it was coming from a different time altogether. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was the ventilation system, or someone in the next room was playing a trick. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the voice was so real, so full of anguish. I pulled my hand back from the wall, and the whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound itself. It was an absolute, suffocating silence that made me feel like I wasn't alone, that whatever was on the other side of that wall knew I was there. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic drum against my ribs that I stared at the paneling, my brain struggling to process what had just happened. Was I hallucinating? Was this some kind of sick joke? The rational part of me was screaming to turn around, go back to my desk, and pretend it never happened. But the other part, the one that was terrified and morbidly curious, was pulling me closer. I reached out again, my fingers trembling, and pressed them against that same cold spot. Nothing. The vibration was gone, and the whisper was gone. I stood there for a good minute, just breathing, trying to calm my shaking hands. Okay, I whispered to myself. It was a joke. It has to be a joke. But as I said the words, a faint scratching sound started up from behind the wood. It was small, like a mouse at first, but it grew louder, faster, and more frantic, like someone was scraping their nails against the inside of the wall, desperate to get out. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a joke. It was too real, too visceral. It was a sound of sheer panic and desperation, a scratching that was so close I could almost feel it on my own skin. Then, the scratching stopped as suddenly as it began, and a new sound replaced it. A deep, guttural moan that sent a shiver straight down my spine. It was a sound of pure agony, a raw, inhuman sound that didn't sound like it belonged to any living person. It was a sound that came from the depths of a soul in torment. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell into a chair. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a terror so profound I couldn't even scream. I just stared at the wall, my eyes wide, waiting for something, anything else to happen. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It felt charged, like the air was full of unseen energy, and I could feel a presence in the room with me, a cold, heavy presence that made it hard to breathe. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, judging me. It felt like I was being weighed and found wanting, like I had disturbed something ancient and malevolent. I had to get out of there. I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I was glued to the chair, a helpless spectator to my own terror. I heard the distinct click of a latch. My eyes darted around the room, but I couldn't see where the sound came from. The air around me grew colder, and a gust of wind, even though all the windows were shut, blew out my desk lamp. The room was plunged into total darkness, the only light coming from the faint moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. My heart was a sledgehammer against my ribs, and the oppressive presence in the room felt like it was pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out, but I was disoriented in the dark. I stumbled forward, my arms outstretched, trying to find the door. That's when I felt it. A cold, ethereal hand brushed against my cheek, and I heard a faint, guttural whisper right next to my ear. "You came for me," the voice rasped. "Now you can stay." A sudden, powerful shove sent me flying backward, and I hit the wall with a sickening thud. The wind was knocked out of me, and for a moment, I saw stars. My head was spinning, but I forced myself to get up. I needed to get out. I just needed to find the door. I blindly ran forward, and my hand found the smooth, cool surface of the mahogany paneling. I pushed on it, expecting it to be solid, but it gave way with a soft, creaking sound, and I stumbled through. The door slammed shut behind me with a heavy, resounding thud. I was plunged into a darkness so complete it was a physical thing, a blackness so thick I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. Panic seized me, a cold, suffocating wave that left me gasping for air. I stumbled forward, my hands outstretched, and hit a solid, unyielding wall. "No, no, no." I whimpered, a frantic, desperate mantra. I turned around and fumbled for the door handle, but there wasn't one. The wall was smooth, seamless. I frantically ran my hands over the surface, my fingers searching for any seam, any crack, anything that would tell me where the door was, but there was nothing. It was like I had walked into a solid box. A deep, bone-chilling cold radiated from the walls, seeping into my skin and making me shiver uncontrollably. It smelled of dust and decay, and a faint, sweet smell that I couldn't place. It was the smell of a forgotten memory, a scent that lingered in the corners of an abandoned room. I was trapped that I started screaming then, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek that tore at my throat. I pounded my fists against the wall, but all I could hear was the hollow echo of my own frantic blows. It was useless. The walls were solid, unyielding, and I was completely, utterly alone. I slid down the wall, my knees hitting the floor, and I started sobbing uncontrollably, the sound muffled by the thick darkness. "Please," I choked out. "Please let me out." My voice was a fragile whisper in the vast, consuming dark. That's when I heard it again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from under my feet, from the floorboards. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone was dragging their fingernails across the wood. I scrambled away, my body shaking with terror. I huddled in a corner, my arms wrapped around my knees, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I was so terrified I couldn't even cry anymore. All I could do was sit there, in the suffocating darkness, and listen to the scraping get closer and closer. It was a sound that promised madness and despair, a sound that told me I wasn't just trapped, but I was in a cage with something else, and it was coming for me. The scratching stopped right in front of me. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see whatever was there, not wanting to know what kind of horror had been waiting for me. The air grew even colder, and the smell of decay intensified. I felt a gust of cold air on my face, and a faint, spectral glow appeared in the air in front of me. It was a dull, sickly yellow light, and it was barely bright enough for me to make out the shape of a figure standing right in front of me. It was a woman, but her face was a blur, a swirling vortex of shadows and sorrow. Her hair was a tangled mess, and her clothes were in tatters, like she had been wearing them for 100 years. Her hands, however, were crystal clear, and I could see them as they reached for my face. They were long, slender, and covered in what looked like dark, caked dirt. Her fingernails were broken and raw, as if she'd been clawing at something for a very, very long time. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just sat there, frozen in a state of catatonic terror, watching as those hands moved closer to my face. She touched my cheek, and the cold was so intense it felt like a brand, a burning ice that seared into my skin. "They came for me too," she whispered, her voice a dry, papery sound that was full of a bottomless sorrow. "They left me here, and they'll leave you too." I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a feeling of my own air being sucked out of my lungs, as if something was draining the life right out of me. My vision blurred, and the spectral figure of the woman began to fade, her glowing form flickering like a faulty light bulb. As she faded, the room began to spin. I felt a sudden rush of vertigo, and the sounds of the scratching and the whispering faded into a low, droning hum. My head felt light, and I felt like I was floating, completely disconnected from my body. I couldn't think, couldn't process anything. I was just a consciousness adrift in a sea of cold, dark nothingness. The last thing I heard was her voice, a final, despairing whisper that echoed in my mind. "Don't let them forget." And then, there was nothing. The darkness consumed me completely, and I felt my consciousness slipping away that I don't know how long I was in there. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, but I remember the feeling of a sudden, blinding light on my face and a loud, sharp sound, like a gunshot, that ripped me from my stupor. "Hey, are you okay?" It was Sarah, the RA. She was standing in the library, holding her phone's flashlight, and she was looking at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. "I was looking for my keys," she said, her voice a little shaky. "And I saw your lamp was out, so I came to check on you. But you weren't at your desk. You were just sitting there, right in the middle of the floor, right in front of the wall." My heart was pounding, and my head was throbbing. I was back in the library, sitting on the dusty floor, right in front of the paneling. The door wasn't open, and the walls were solid. It was as if I had never left. I just sat there, my hands shaking, unable to speak. I was so relieved to be out that I felt like I was going to throw up. Sarah helped me up, and I stumbled to my feet, my legs wobbly and weak. "What were you doing there?" she asked, her voice softer now, her flashlight beams sweeping across the room. "And why are you so pale?" I didn't know what to say. How could I explain what had happened? How could I tell her that I had been in a secret, dark room, a room that supposedly didn't exist? How could I tell her about the ghost, about the cold, and about the feeling of life being sucked out of me? I just shook my head, unable to form the words. She seemed to get the message. She led me back to my room, and I spent the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, unable to sleep, my mind replaying the events over and over. I couldn't shake the cold feeling from my cheek where the ghost had touched me. The next morning, I packed my bags, and I checked out of the Christie mansion. I never went back, and I never told anyone what really happened. I ended up staying with a friend in a different residence for the rest of the semester, and I eventually transferred to a different university the following year. I just couldn't stay. I still can't explain it, but I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. The urban legend is just that, a story. But what happened to me was real, and it was a reminder that some stories aren't just for scaring people around a campfire. Sometimes they're a warning from a place that still holds a secret, and from a soul that still isn't at rest. My name is Leo, and this story I'm about to tell you happened back in 2016, during my sophomore year at Sarah Lawrence. At the time, I was living off campus with two friends in a little rented house a few blocks away from the college, and my life was pretty much a mess, to be honest. I was in a weird place, still trying to figure out what I wanted to major in, and my parents were breathing down my neck about my grades. I spent most of my time holed up in my room, either studying or just mindlessly scrolling through my phone, trying to escape the pressure. I was a bit of a recluse, which was probably why I was so oblivious to the weird stuff happening around me until it was too late. I remember one of my roommates, a guy named Mark who was always a little too loud and boisterous, constantly complaining about strange noises coming from the attic, but I always just dismissed it as him being dramatic. I was so wrapped up in my own little world that I couldn't see the bigger picture that it was a chilly Tuesday in late October, the kind of day where the sky is a bruised purple and the wind howls like a lonely wolf. I had a huge paper due the next day, and I was deep in the throes of procrastination, surrounded by a sea of half-empty coffee cups and crumpled up notes. My other roommate, Sarah, was out with her new boyfriend, and Mark had gone to a friend's place to study, so I was all alone in the house. I remember the silence being almost deafening. broken only by the rhythmic tapping of my keyboard and the occasional creak of the old house settling. It was around 11 p.m. when I finally decided to call it a night, but as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. A faint, repetitive thudding sound coming from the attic, like someone was methodically dropping a heavy book on the floor over and over again. My stomach dropped. It was exactly what Mark had been talking about, and suddenly, the silence of the house felt less comforting and more menacing. It was a sound that had no place in the late hours of the night, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I knew, in that gut-wrenching moment, that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. First, I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe some old pipes groaning, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was a consistent, heavy thudding, like a heartbeat you could feel in your bones. My mind, which was already a mess of stress and anxiety, immediately went to the worst-case scenario. I kept picturing something or someone in the attic, just sitting there in the dark, thudding away for God knows what reason. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but the sound didn't stop. It became an obsessive loop in my head, a drumbeat of dread that was impossible to ignore. I even went to the hallway and stood right under the access hatch, a little metal square in the ceiling that led to the attic. The thuds felt louder, more present, right above me. I swear I could feel the floorboards vibrating beneath my feet. I considered calling Mark, but what would I even say? Hey, the ghost you've been talking about is now playing a morbid game of drums in our attic. I knew he'd just laugh at me, and I couldn't handle that right now. I went back to my room and tried to distract myself, but it was useless. The thudding had a strange, hypnotic quality to it, and my mind started racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound was too heavy for a small animal. It sounded like something big, something with weight. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house being an old house, but there was a deep-seated feeling of wrongness in the air. The silence of the house had been replaced by a chilling symphony of thuds, and the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. The air in my room felt thick and heavy, and I could barely breathe. I remember thinking how surreal it all was, how I was sitting in my own home, supposed to be safe, yet feeling like a prisoner in a horror movie. My eyes kept darting to my closed bedroom door, as if expecting something to burst through it at any moment. The thuds continued, a relentless reminder that I wasn't alone, and my sense of dread only deepened with each beat. It was a terror that was quiet and internal, but just as potent as any loud, flashy scare. That I spent what felt like an eternity sitting on my bed, clutching my laptop, just listening. The thuds were still there, but they had changed. They weren't just a simple, rhythmic beat anymore. There was now a pattern to them, like a distorted, agonizing code being tapped out. It was a pattern of 3 quick thuds, a pause, and then one long, drawn-out thud. It was unsettling in a way I can't even describe, because it felt intentional, like someone was trying to communicate. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. I finally mustered up the courage to grab my phone, and I started recording the sound. My hands were shaking so much that the phone kept slipping, but I managed to press record and point it towards the ceiling. I wanted proof, something I could show Mark and Sarah later so they wouldn't think I was crazy. The fear had turned into a strange mixture of terror and morbid curiosity. I needed to know what was up there. I needed to understand what I was hearing. As I was recording, the pattern of the thuds changed again. This time, it was slow and deliberate, a single, heavy thud every few seconds. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy piece of furniture across the floor right above my room. I felt a cold dread wash over me. I was frozen, just staring at the ceiling, my phone still pointed up, recording the new, terrifying sound. That's when I heard it, faint at first, but growing louder. A whisper. It was coming from the attic, a low, raspy whisper that sounded like dry leaves rustling. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. It was a voice, and it was right there, above me. My blood ran cold, and the rational part of my brain completely shut down. I stopped recording and backed away from the bed, my eyes still glued to the ceiling. The thudding stopped. The whispering stopped. Everything went dead silent. The silence was worse than the sound, a suffocating void that seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I felt like a mouse trapped in a maze with a predator I couldn't see, and every part of my body screamed at me to run, to get out of the house. But I couldn't. My feet were cemented to the floor, my breath caught in my throat. That oppressive silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. The tension in the air was so thick I could almost taste it. Then, a new sound cut through the quiet. A slow, deliberate creak, as if someone was carefully opening the attic hatch. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the cage of my chest. I couldn't move. I just stood there, paralyzed, staring at the metal square in the ceiling. The creaking stopped. Silence again. I squeezed my eyes shut, a silent plea for it all to be a dream, a horrible, sleep-deprived hallucination. When I opened them, nothing had changed, but a new wave of nausea washed over me. The smell. A cloying, sickly sweet scent like old flowers left in a vase too long mixed with something metallic and pungent, like rusty iron. It was a smell I'll never forget, a smell that clung to the air and made me feel like I was suffocating. I finally managed to unfreeze and backed away, my hands groping for the doorknob behind me. I had to get out, had to get to my car, to anywhere but there. Just as my hand touched the cold metal, a loud, violent crash from the attic made me jump. It sounded like a dresser being tipped over, followed by the shattering of glass. My scream got stuck in my throat, a choked gasp of pure terror. Then I heard something heavy land on the floorboards right above me, a sound that was less of a thud and more of a thump squelch. My stomach churned. It sounded like something had fallen. No, not fallen. It sounded like a sack of something wet and heavy had been dropped. A soft, wet shuffling sound followed, getting closer and closer to my room. I didn't even think. I just fumbled with the doorknob, twisted it open, and burst out of the house into the cold night air, not bothering to lock the door behind me. I ran, my lungs burning with each desperate gulp of air, not stopping until I was safely inside my car, shivering uncontrollably that I sat in my car, shaking so hard the whole vehicle was vibrating. I couldn't stop looking at the house, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. It looked completely normal, like a charming little home where nothing terrifying could ever happen. But I knew what I'd heard, what I'd smelled, and the image of that wet, heavy sound was seared into my brain. I pulled out my phone to call Mark, but my fingers were too numb to dial. I was a complete wreck, a sobbing, panicked mess in my car. A few minutes later, I saw Mark's car pull into the driveway, and I felt a brief flicker of relief, but it was immediately replaced by a fresh wave of panic. He was going to go inside. He was going to walk right into whatever was in that attic. I got out of my car and ran towards him, screaming his name, my voice raw and hoarse. He looked at me, bewildered, as I reached him. I was a mess, my face streaked with tears and snot, my clothes disheveled. I grabbed him by the shoulders and started babbling, a frantic, incoherent stream of words about the thudding, the whispering, the sound of something falling. He tried to calm me down, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. He told me to take a deep breath, and he promised he'd check the attic, but I wouldn't let him go inside alone. I was convinced something was waiting for him, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I let him walk into a trap. We stood outside for a while, arguing, until he finally agreed to call the cops. We explained the situation as best we could, but I'm sure we sounded like two crazy college kids on drugs. They promised they'd send someone over, but it was clear from their tone they didn't take us seriously. We waited for what felt like an hour, huddled together on the porch steps, shivering from the cold and the fear. The police finally arrived, two bored-looking officers who clearly thought we were wasting their time. They listened to our story with thinly veiled skepticism, and then, with a sigh, one of them took out his flashlight and went inside. We waited outside, our hearts in our throats, listening to the silence. A few minutes later, he came back out, a puzzled look on his face. "There's nothing up there," he said, and I could feel my blood turn to ice. "The attic is empty. There's nothing moved, no broken glass, no sign of anyone or anything being up there." My jaw dropped. Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. I knew what I had heard. I knew the sounds were real, but there was no evidence, no proof. The officer's face softened a little, and he put a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe you were just stressed out, kid. It's late. You should get some sleep." They left after that, and Mark and I just stood there, staring at the house. He eventually went inside, and I followed him reluctantly. unable to shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting. We never went back into the attic, and we eventually moved out a few months later, but I'll never forget that night. I'll never forget the sound of the thudding, the smell, and the feeling of something watching me from the dark.